Dr. Bronfenbrenner.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
So I have a power problem with my computer here.
Okay. Proceed, Dr. Bronfenbrenner.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce and members of the board. I don't know if it should be said, it's a pleasure to be here again, but I appreciate how well you've organized these sessions. As you know, I was here 3 years ago with my preliminary findings from a study that I did with Professor Dorian Warren on the nature of employer campaigns, unfair labor practices, serious unfair labor practices, and serious unfair labor practices won and settled, and their impact on election timing. At that our findings from that study had helped to inform the rulemaking process, and at that time we were asked to come back to the board, expanding our data to include 5 years worth of data, and here we are. Central to those findings was developing a new and better measure of election timing based on using the date ULPs actually occur rather than the date they're filed or the date of petition, because the timing of delay is really based on from when the employer campaign starts, and the employer campaign, a better measure is to use the date of the first unfair labor practice occurrence. And so our research we're talking about today is based on using unfair labor practice documents FOIA'd from the NLRB with a 99% return rate of a sample of elections from 1999, random sample elections from 1999 to 2003, using documents, everything from the charge to the employer response to the complaint to the board decision. Our findings tell us a great deal about the extent and impact of delay on election timing and the two issues that are being addressed by this panel. Employers are aware of union campaigns and begin exercising their free speech rights much earlier than has been assumed. We found that 56% of all unfair labor practices and 57% of those that have merit determination occur before the petition. The percent of cases were 46% of serious ULPs and 48% of those that had won or settled pre-merit determination or pre-hearing are before the petition. And 30% of serious ULPs and allegations and 30% of ULPs won happened 30 days before the petition is filed. And these serious allegations are ones that involve, many of them involve speech. They are interrogations, they're threats, they are they're harassment, but they're also these are the kinds of unfair labor practices that cause campaigns often to stop in their tracks and are most intimidating to workers. Discharges, alteration of wages and benefits, and we found that these unfair labor practice charges start long before the petition is filed and continue unabated throughout the campaign, all the way through the petition, the election, and continue beyond. Most significant about these is not only do these do employers know about these tactics before the petition is filed? But we aren't even counting the many campaigns where unfair labor practices occur and unions or workers don't even file the charge because if it's a win, they don't want to bother to file the charge, or if it's they know that they're losing, workers don't file the charge, or they don't file a charge because they feel all they're going to get is a posting. So that in combination, what our data show is employer campaigns are starting before the petition, in many cases long before the petition. They're continuing unabated all the way through, so that each day that goes by is another day. Each day that you extend the time for when the election happens is another day where workers are threatened, harassed, discharged, coerced, and that the timing of the election really matters, and that employer free speech is in no way threatened by this rule change, because employers are beginning their campaigns and are have great opportunity to engage with workers and are taking that opportunity because they know about union campaigns well before the petition is filed. Thank you.
There's been discussion about the impact this would have on small employers. Does your study address situations involving small employers?
One of the things that we forget is that what may seem like a small employer, the ultimate parent company is not small. And so we have to separate out small employers and who their parent company is. So that's the first thing. So many of these construction firms are ultimately often owned by much larger employers, and we researched the ownership of every single firm in our sample, and we found that many of the organizers and many of the workers did not even know who owned their firm, but that in construction that the employers are often part of bigger firms than they think. But also that these firms, they have in construction, in grocers, in all of these industries, they have many liability issues. And we found that they all had lawyers. They have lawyers because they have lawyers for other issues, not they pull those lawyers in for the labor issues. But they have lawyers. They have when you look at the documents, they had no trouble having a lawyer. They weren't slower in responding to charges than the large employers. They weren't less likely to commit unfair labor practices by any means. The size of the employer had nothing to do with their reaction. Actually, what we found that was most striking is that these small employers were expending an enormous amount of money on fighting unions that seemed to outweigh what their budget should be. So you would have a very small nursing home that had all Medicaid patients, and they were spending great resources in hiring a consultant to fight the union campaign, or a small construction firm that was hiring one of the most expensive consultants in the area. And you wondered, how could they afford that? And then we would realize that they were being subsidized by that there actually was the employer association that was probably helping them in the area.
Professor Bronfenbrenner, thanks for being with us today. With respect to potential unlawful conduct that occurs during campaigns, Do you oppose the views expressed in the dissenting opinion authored by Member Johnson and myself, suggesting that the board should directly attempt to more effectively identify unlawful conduct that occurs during union representation elections, and if it occurs, we should focus directly on trying to develop measures that more effectively remedy that conduct if it's found to have occurred?
Well, you tried to do that. I mean, many of us tried to do that with the Employer Free Choice Act, but you're not going to be able to get penalties, more effective penalties, unless you involve Congress.
Well, we already have the right in some range of cases to impose bargaining orders in the face of unlawful conduct if it's found to exist within a range of types of illegality, and even dispense with an election. Is that right?
That's right, and I read through all the cases, and I watched the employers appeal every one of those bargaining orders all the way through the courts, and that doesn't help in a campaign if it takes 5 years to get a bargaining order.
Well, my question was, do you support or would you oppose efforts by the board to directly address unlawful conduct if it occurs during a union representation election, and to directly attempt to devise more effective measures to address that if it's found to have occurred?
I think the board should do everything that's practical. Yes, that's what the proposal is, but I don't think that you can do more than that. And I think that, I mean, that's what the proposal is. I think that the problem is you don't control the courts, and the time it takes. So yes, by all means, use bargaining orders. But bargaining orders will be challenged by the people in this. There are not very many people in the room anymore, but the people in this room, there needs to be a shortening of the time between the petition and the election, because there's so much time that occurs before the petition.
The one other question I had, and I referred to more effective measures and use bargaining orders as one possible example, but the Act permits a union to file a petition based on a 30% showing of interest, but a union can be certified by the board only if more than 50% of the employees end up expressing support for the union in an election. So do you agree that structure means Congress intended that there would be some reasonable period after petition filing for unions, among other things, to have the opportunity to get more employee support than maybe been expressed in the original showing of interest?
No union today, in their right mind, files with less than 60 or 70% on cards.
But my question relates to what Congress intended in the structure reflected in the Act.
Congress wrote the Act at a different time. I don't think at the time they wrote the Act, most unions were organizing through recognition.
Are we circumscribed by what Congress intended and what Congress ended up incorporated into the Act that we enforce?
I think that you are, like any law, legislative history binds you, but you have your regulatory powers to do rule changes, and that's what you can do. Congress allows you to the law says that you are supposed to try to do everything to promote the right to workers to organize, the individual right to choose between a employer and the union. And right now, workers are not able to make that choice because they are afraid. They are terrified. They have to jump through hoops of fire before they're able to organize. And that was not the intent of the act, as it was not intent of the Wagner Act or Taft-Hartley, that workers had to literally go through trials of fire to choose whether they wanted a union or not.
And if we can address that directly, that issue directly, I take it you'd support those efforts.
Yes, but I think it has to, the way to do it is to not have them have to go through that over and over and over again, and that's shortening the time period. Employer free speech is not at risk. Employers have lots of time to communicate. There is no question that they know when union campaigns are happening, because unions cannot win today unless they are open about their campaigns.
Yeah, I'll defer to my other members for any other questions.
I just have two data questions, really simple. In terms of you said in conducting the study, you came across instances of time of hiring consultants and time of hiring lawyers, because I assumed you must have found that somewhere since you're testifying about it. Is it anywhere in the 2011 or 2014 comments or somewhere on an online exposition of the study where that was actually measured when employers hired consultants or when employers hired lawyers when you went through your database?
I collected the size of when I collected the documents and saw the employer response, but we researched every company, right? And so we would see whether they had who signed the documents, whether they had an unfair labor practice, whether they filed an unfair labor practice. So we'd see whether it was a small company or a large company. We had the size of the company. I went and we went and looked at the size of the parent company, and so we would know whether they were, whether they had filed unfair labor practices. We would know. We looked up the parent company for all 1,000 cases.
Right. Maybe I'm not being clear. I'm just trying to find out that in your study you started collecting the data points on time when the employer hired a consultant or time when the employer hired a lawyer related to the campaign, not necessarily the unfair labor practice.
No, well, we knew that they had, in terms of when their first unfair labor practice was committed.
Okay, so the unfair labor practice is basically the proxy that you're using for the employer's running of its campaign. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.